Joining the show now is Arif Hasan, Minnesota Vikings beat reporter with The Athletic, to help unpack his recent piece titled, quote, "With the 2022 Super Bowl in town, LA attempts to shine up its homeless crisis. They're just putting a Band-Aid on something that needs stitches," end quote. There's a lot to discuss here. We're thrilled to have you on. Arif, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
No, so in your piece, you talk about LA's street sweeps, which essentially force unhoused people to relocate in an effort to clean up, and I'm going to put air quotes around clean up the city. How are those sweeps actually defined, and what makes them legal versus illegal?
Yeah, so there's two categories of sweeps actually, at least in Ninth Circuit jurisprudence. It gets kind of like into the weeds really quickly, but in Los Angeles, they've conducted two types of sweeps. One is temporary, designed to literally clean things up, which is to displace people for, in theory, 6 to 8 hours, often much longer, and clean the sidewalks, clean up any trash that's been gathered, and so on, and then people are, quote unquote, allowed to return back to where they live. And those are the temporary sweeps, and that's where most of the sweeps that are being conducted in California are done under that kind of definition of a sweep. And then there's a permanent sweep, which, as you can tell from the name, is designed to eliminate any presence of unhoused people in the area, at least from a permanent standpoint, things like encampments and stuff like that. And so at that point, they require them to move off. And so there's two different kinds of law that surround those two kinds of sweeps, and they try to make it very clear which type of sweep they're performing so that they make it obvious under which set of laws the sweep that they're conducting falls under, although there's theory and then there's practice. And the reality is that very often they will use these temporary sweeps as a means of kind of signaling that they don't want anybody there, and they'll continue harassing them until they kind of move off. But they get to call that kind of voluntary removal, and so they don't have to follow the jurisprudence of a permanent sweep, which requires a lot more resources from the government side.
Let's zoom out for a second. There are, at last count, 60 plus thousand people living on the streets of Los Angeles. That number is surely much higher, owing to the fallout from COVID-19 and the various pandemic impacts on the city. And I believe the city is not scheduled to count again until later, like not later this year. So post Super Bowl, we're not even going to have an accurate count of how many people are currently living on the streets. We don't know. What is it? We talk about this as as if it's a complex issue. Really, the bottom line is there's just not enough houses. There's not enough. We're not building enough houses. There's not enough housing. As you kind of attempted to explore the intractable nature of this issue, what were some of the things you were struck by, the takeaways that you have from grappling with this?
I think first that there's probably enough places for people to live. On a fundamental issue. Some of it has to do with pricing. Some of it has to do with kind of the qualifications for housing, like having a credit history, for example, that's very difficult for some people to come by. And then also, one thing that kind of struck me is that there have been a lot of solutions that have been proposed that a lot of people are very enthusiastic about, including a number of the unhoused people that I talked to, that are just not being implemented for one reason or the other. And so there's an element of NIMBYism, which for people who are unfamiliar is not in my backyard. So there's a lot of funding that's being devoted to providing services and providing shelter for people without permanent homes. But they need to build it, and nobody wants, a shelter nearby. And very often they'll phrase it in, this would actually not be a very good community for them. It would, this would be dangerous for them. And it's like, well, I mean, you live here. I don't what are you talking about? But this is. There's a lot of neighborhood level politics that prevent a lot of the initiatives from going forward, and then there's new initiatives to build kind of tiny homes, which If you watch like tiny homes on YouTube and stuff like that, personally,
I watch
for
it
me,
on HGTV.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't, those don't look like remarkable places for me to live, but in terms of, finding permanent housing and, getting access to stuff like, sewage, right, and trash cleanup and city services, they actually provide a lot. And also the tiny homes that are provided on HGTV, run $200,000. Whereas the ones that are being proposed here, there's like a pilot project out in the outskirts of LA that was really successful. Those are obviously much cheaper, as you would expect a smaller house to be. So there's a lot of solutions out there that need to be implemented that aren't. So that's kind of one thing that struck me. And another thing that struck me, I think, is just humanity, right? Like it's so easy to talk to so many people that are being impacted by these sweeps, and so many people choose not to, right? These are people that, almost everyone I talk to wants permanent housing. I think when I published the piece, I saw a lot of comments saying, hey, I worked in a homeless shelter, and, a lot of these people don't want homes. And it's just like, well, I don't know, maybe you're remembering one or two big stories, but, I talked to a lot of people, and they certainly want a place to live. This is important to them. They also want community, and kind of a lot of the solutions that are proposed do not find ways to allow them to keep connections with the community that they've built for themselves, which is important in a lot of ways for both safety and mental health reasons. Just as you and I want community, just as we always want to be in contact with our friends and family, it's kind of the same thing. And so, a lot of this just comes down to, like, if you're reflective on yourself, if you find yourself in a situation where you don't have a permanent home, what would you want? Well, it shouldn't be shocking that that's exactly what they want. And these are people that have a lot of the not that this should be an important determinant of whether or not someone deserves fundamental human rights, but I think people would be surprised to find that they have a lot of the same skill sets that you and I have. In fact, a lot of the people I talk to have more important skill sets than me. I mean, I'm just a writer. These are people that have the ability to produce really wonderful music. I was able to listen to some really wonderful music, and also, computer programmers and construction workers, and people that have really solid foundational skills for how a society should operate.
With the Olympics coming to LA in 2028, I'm curious, in what ways did hosting the Super Bowl set a precedent for how LA is going to handle hosting major sporting events? And will that change the league's consideration for national events? Is that any type of discussion there?
Yeah, one of the groups I talked to was No Olympics LA 28. One of the reasons that they were focusing on, what was happening to the unhoused population in Los Angeles in preparation for the Super Bowl is because they saw this as a bit of a dry run for, what the county really of Los Angeles and all of its various municipalities inside might do in preparation for the Olympics, or for World Cup events or other events that might be held in the greater Los Angeles area. A lot of people kind of evaluate this, including a lot of the unhoused people I talk to, see this as kind of a dry run for what might happen when the Olympics come. And so I think that from the perspective of the people performing the sweeps, which in the case of the individual sweeps that I was covering was performed by the California Department of Transportation, often called Caltrans, I think they thought of that as a success. Now, in terms of like the human costs of those sweeps, obviously an enormous failure, but, it kind of depends on what your perspective is and what your goals are. And their goals are to provide a shinier view of what Los Angeles looks like to tourists and to cameras and whatever. And from that perspective, to them, it would be a success. And so I think that the tools that they picked up on for this are going to be tools that they employ for, things like, the Olympics and other events that will be held in Los Angeles.
Takeline is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy. Underdog Fantasy is the best and easiest way to play fantasy sports. With their slick mobile app and user-friendly website, you'll have no problem jumping in, lifting your leg, and drafting your squad. Try the Pick'em games. You can win up to 20 times, 20x. A dog's years is 7 years to one human. Underdog Fantasy is 20 times your money, potentially, that you could win in one night. Pick over under on your favorite players' stats to win big games. Pick between 2 and 5 players. And you can also pick from rivals, which pits 2 players against each other. Some great love-hate dynamic possible there. Sign up now with code TAKELINE, and you will double your first deposit up to $100 in bonus cash when you make your first deposit of $10 or more. Deposit $100, get $100 free. Why don't you play today? Just to kind of draw a line under it, this is an intractable problem that has been going on for decades. There's been a consistent and relatively stable unhoused population in downtown LA for almost 100 years now. The issues and the obstacles that are keeping the solutions from moving down the track are essentially the same as they have been for decades. This is not going anywhere. Lots of people have put forward solutions. Nothing happens. The federal government has put up money to help Los Angeles house some of its unhoused population in hotels using different solutions. The city has not taken the money. That money is, I guess, sitting in a bank account somewhere, among many other things that would lead a person to believe that maybe the LA city government is not like really trying that hard to figure out a solution to this. And out of the sky comes a solution, essentially. Have these big events. It's a win-win for everybody, right? It burnishes the image of Los Angeles on the international stage. It boosts the economy, at least a certain kind of economy. And, under the cover of all of this, you can, very quietly, or at least moderately quietly, sweep away the unhoused population without too much hustle and bustle from anyone. I think that personally, that sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it also appears to be what is happening.
I understand. I think that there is some element of this, right? I don't think that you're completely off track. And I think kind of to bolster that case, Los Angeles has been fighting with the city, in this case, Los Angeles has been fighting with the various other municipalities that comprise the greater Los Angeles area. Cities like Culver City, for example, that are like part of Los Angeles, but have their own set of laws and police and so on, about, whether or not to enforce particular laws, because the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has ruled that you cannot engage in a permanent sweep without immediately providing alternative housing options for any of the unhoused people that you're, destroying the encampments of. And Los Angeles, the city, is abiding by it, but a lot of the areas around it, like, for example, the Super Bowl was held in Inglewood, technically, and not Los Angeles. And Culver City, for example, has been a big, I guess I would say, violator of this particular principle. Los Angeles has been fighting, saying that they're not actually upholding the court ruling, which is why there are so many encampments inside the city of Los Angeles. But at the same time, Los Angeles is not like they're just trying not to get sued. They actually passed a new law making it easier for them to sweep up encampments on a permanent basis. They get to every city council member gets to designate particular areas within their ward or district that encampments can't be set up, and so it actually concentrates a lot of these encampments in areas that are less visible, and you can start forcing people into those encampments again when you hold these big events. And so I think these big events allow Los Angeles to kind of get around this fight that they're having with a bunch of the other kind of areas around Los Angeles, the cities around Los Angeles, by engaging in these temporary sweeps with kind of a wink nudge understanding that actually, even though these are held under kind of the legal jurisdiction of a temporary sweep, these are actually kind of permanent. We want you to kind of move out. And it concentrates these encampments, and the concentration of encampments is itself this enormous problem, because it increases violations of personal autonomy. Crimes are committed in higher density population areas for encampments. These social tensions rise. New people are coming in. That I was talking about, that sense of community that gets disrupted when you concentrate encampments. It increases the number of fires that occur in encampments. Every sweep usually results, probably inadvertently, but certainly indirectly, in deaths. It is a fundamental human issue when you move someone away from an area where they've been living for the past couple of years. No matter how abhorrent those living conditions look to you, if you destroy it, you're not doing them a favor. There's a reason that they were set up there. And so people's property gets destroyed in a way that severely impacts their ability to get a job. Things like government identification. Their survival property gets destroyed. Things like those tents that I was talking about, which shield them from shelter. Sleeping bags are remarkably important. And their immune systems are shot because they don't have the nutrition, and their stress levels are really high, and all of the other things that impact your immune system. And so the incidence of disease are up. through no fault of their own, right? Just because of the way that they're being forced to live. And as you increase density, all of these problems kind of mount on themselves. And so, it very much from the 10,000 foot view, if you're like the mayor of Los Angeles, you would love kind of more events to come in. And what's really interesting, if you kind of track a lot of how these events are pitched and run. The head of the chair of the Super Bowl committee, Casey Wasserman, was also the chair of the Los Angeles Olympics. Yeah, the Los Angeles Olympics Committee, who also has his name on, I think, the UCLA Athletics Training Facility, the Wasserman Training Facility. And so, I mean, he's a huge sports guy. I mean, he used to own like an arena football league team, and he's very into it. And so, his thing is entertainment. But he's been asked pretty directly about the contributions to the homelessness crisis, and he's deflected every time. And so, there's some element, I think, where this allows them to get around looking like that they're not paying attention to the court ruling surrounding how you can treat unhoused people. But there's also just an element of, I love having sports in my city, and I don't really care about the consequences of that.
It's interesting because you talked about like the same guy is connected to both. I'm curious your thoughts on cities getting the bid to have these big events. Like, for instance, the small markets, as we know, in leagues like the NBA and any league, it's hard for small markets to thrive because free agents are going to gravitate towards LA, New York, the sexy cities, Miami, shouts to Atlanta. Y'all better come on over here too. But the free agents don't necessarily gravitate towards there. The attractions don't necessarily gravitate towards there. Is there a world where it would make sense that a city of LA not get such big events, or is that a conversation had at all about where these events are going? Because we talk about it. The Super Bowl is this year in LA. 2028 is the Olympics in LA. All-Stars in Cleveland for the NBA, and I feel like that could be huge for the city. So is there a conversation about what cities get the bids or not?
I mean, there's always kind of a conversation about what are the criteria by which to award these bids. And to some degree, they pay a lot of lip service to things like social impact and kind of their social responsibility. But at the end of the day, I don't think that they pay that much attention unless it becomes egregious. Like, I think famously when, the NCAA pulled out of North Carolina because of the trans bathroom bill, or the NFL pulled out of Arizona because of the refusal to recognize Martin Luther King Jr., the holiday. Those are kind of big, and those are really important events. But I think that the NFL kind of knew that they were going to win that fight. And so, which is why they were willing to do it. I think when it comes to kind of these social problems that are not kind of in the mainstream, and by in the mainstream, I don't mean that there's like this overwhelming groundswell of support for trans people in the public. That's certainly not the case, but certainly that's been a big talking point. I think that when it comes to an issue that just becomes under-discussed, like, for example, homelessness and the unhoused population, it's just not something that ends up becoming part of any criteria. We saw this when Minneapolis hosted the Super Bowl. They performed a number of sweeps of unhoused people, which, it's pretty cold in Minneapolis, especially in February. So that was monstrous. And then, of course, that occurred in Atlanta when Atlanta hosted the Super Bowl as well. And
Come on, Atlanta.
You got to do better, right? And I think that, these discussions can be part of it. But I think that ultimately, these big events will choose host locations that either accomplish their goals indirectly. So, for example, Super Bowls are always awarded to cities that fund new stadiums, or that new stadiums are built in. You don't necessarily have to fund one, but that's, we all understand that that's part of the process, unless you're Jerry Jones, right? Like, I think that if you participate in building a new stadium, a Super Bowl is going to head over there, and that takes precedence over any of this other stuff that I mentioned. Or even a more corrupt organization like FIFA, they have no problem having their stadiums built by slave labor in Qatar, right? And so, these giant events will go where the host cities treat them the best, and they'll pay homage to stuff like tradition, right? Like the World Cup wanted to be in Brazil because of the importance of soccer in Brazil, and there were a bunch of infrastructural problems that presented problems for running the event. But for the most part, they want to accomplish the long-term goals of the organization, which is to not pay for stadiums, which is to have big audiences and so on.
Well, you can tell a lot about what we value as a country by the fact that LA needs more affordable housing, and what we have is a $5 billion stadium with a 2-acre lake. His name is Arif Hasan, Minnesota Vikings beat reporter with The Athletic, and his new story on homelessness in Los Angeles and the effects of the Super Bowl on that population is out now. It's well worth your time. Arif, thank you for joining Takeline.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.